For more analysis on this, let's bring in Andreas Krieg. He's an Associate Professor in the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. Thanks for being on the program, Andreas. So Assad has very rarely travelled outside of Syria during the civil war, as we mentioned before, Rosalind, only visiting allies Russia and Iran. So what's the context of this particular visit to the UAE?
Right. This is quite a remarkable development. Obviously, the UAE have already for years tried to get the Syrians and the Syrian regime back into the Arab fold and have done so fairly successfully. I mean, convincing other Arab partners to potentially go with Assad and endorsing him as the rightful leader in Syria. At the same time, I mean, we need to understand that, the UAE are having obviously economic interest in Syria and trying to benefit from what would be the rebuilding of the regime. And third of all, obviously, both countries kind of align themselves intellectually and ideologically over the counter-revolutionary narrative of saying we want to bring an end to the Arab Spring and this kind of disruptive decade and rebuild something called authoritarian stability. But the broader geostrategic context is obviously one where the Emiratis are trying to send a message to the United States to say, look, you guys have left us as in the Middle East in a vacuum by your partial withdrawal. The partnership that we have with the United States is no longer functioning. You're not delivering on the security guarantees that you're giving, particularly as we're looking towards the JCPOA 2.0 being negotiated with Iran. And the Emiratis are saying we're taking over responsibility. You want to share the burden, we are taking the burden, but we're doing it our way. And we'll take any kind of liberty as we see fit to deal with partners that we consider to be partners, even if that goes against the interests and values of the West, interests and values of the United States.
I want to get to Washington's role in all of this shortly, but firstly, the UAE has been normalising ties with Assad for some time. So what do you make of the timing of this particular visit?
Obviously, it couldn't be a more daunting timing, considering that this is now the 11th year anniversary of the start of the revolution in Syria. And obviously, the UAE, from the beginning, were very much against civil societal mobilization. They were against the revolutions. They were against protests. And they have always been on the counter-revolutionary side. And they are the leading counter-revolutionary country in this part of the world. So to them, kind of sending that kind of statement, to the world, saying, look, this is now the end of the Arab Spring. Syria's president is now back in the fold. We're inviting him. We're normalizing relations with him on this very day. Kind of is a clear statement that the revolutions have failed and Arab authoritarian stability is there to stay, and it's going to be led by the United Arab Emirates as the key counter-revolutionary country.
I want to get your thoughts now on Washington's influence in all of this. What does this meeting say about the US and its influence in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, this is the partnership between the United States and Saudi Arabia, as well as the relationship between the United States and the UAE, is in a state of crisis and has been for quite some time. There's a disagreement fundamentally about the role the United States are playing in terms of security. There's a fundamental disagreement in Abu Dhabi about the liberal order and what the liberal order is providing to the Gulf. And as the US is withdrawing, it has created a vacuum where the UAE have risen. The UAE have risen over the last 8-9 years into the most powerful and most influential player in this part of the world, and they've done so in the vacuum of American partial withdrawal, intellectual withdrawal from this part of the world. And the Emiratis are kind of sending a message of saying we are now the middle power here, and we're taking over responsibility, but we are pivoting away from the West, and our consequence of this partial US withdrawal is a reintegration with the East. We see that new authoritarian order developing, very closely tied to Moscow, very closely tied to Beijing, where the UAE are looking for alternatives, and they're already building alternative relationships outside of Washington. And that means that the United States now are confronted with a situation where they have to make choices as well. What is the consequence of that in terms of where the Americans are going in their influence networks? And it seems like they've found a partner in Qatar, which is a bit more reliable, which is not U-turning. And at the same time, we've got the UAE, which is pivoting towards the East. And that is definitely undermining US soft and hard power in this part of the world. And it will be very difficult for the US to rein them in now.
Plenty of moving parts to this story. Thank you very much for giving us your insights, Andreas Krieg, there from the King's College London. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.